Hey everybody, welcome to the first ever hptuners live stream training class. My name is Alex Peitz of Peitz Performance Tunes, and I will be your instructor for the day. For today, we are going to be covering engine fundamentals. Please be sure to stay attent and listen along because we are actually going to be giving away an NPVI2 at the end of the class for the first person to answer the question correctly. So please be sure to stay tuned as we go along. I'm really excited about this, guys. And, we've been wanting to do this for a while. And, here we are today. So I really am very fortunate to have you guys along for the ride with me. And if you guys have questions, we're going to try to keep them kind of keep the program rolling today, just to keep getting through the curriculum. And if you want to write those questions down, please feel free to submit them to me after class via Facebook Messenger or through my Instagram at Peitz Performance. Or if you want to email me as well, you can send me an email directly to alex at peitzperformancetunes.com. Or also feel free to ask one of the good folks at HB Tuners as well. We're all here to help you guys out along the way. So you guys probably want to get right into it, and I want to too as well. So without further ado, let's get rolling along. Again, we're going to be talking about engine fundamentals. Now, as some of you might have already may have guessed, there may be a little. This may be something a lot of you guys at home already know about, and I'm going to try to keep it as fresh as possible, as entertaining as possible, and also we're going to try to approach it from a tuner's aspect or a tuner's perspective, more so than an engine builder's perspective. Try to keep it more interesting than your typical shop class, at home or in high school or whatever it may have been. So let's get rolling along. So first things first, we're going to talk about the four strokes, right? You guys probably already know what these are, but again, we're going to cover it: intake, compression, combustion, exhaust, right? So those are the four strokes we're going to be talking about today. In addition to the four strokes, we're going to be hitting on the importance of the first four strokes and also valve events in conjunction with those strokes, right? So it's really going to all kind of compile up and make a lot more sense. And I've got some pretty cool ways of looking at this in terms of volumetric efficiency and spark advance and how those things are intertwined and how it's going to help you get a better understanding from a tuning perspective of how these things are going to work together. All right, so let's start off at the intake stroke. I'm going to pull up a little diagram for you guys to look at so you can kind of follow along a little bit easier. Visual cues are always awesome. All right. I'm not going to bore you with PowerPoint presentation, so don't worry about that. All right. So first and foremost, we have the intake stroke. On the intake stroke, the intake valve is open, right? The exhaust valve is closed. So the piston is traveling downward, right, towards bottom dead center. So it's creating a negative pressure. So essentially, you have a higher pressure outside the cylinder than you have inside the cylinder. So that's creating flow into the cylinder. So as the piston is traveling downward, also it's getting fuel injected at this time as well. So air fuel mixture is entering into the combustion chamber, into the cylinder, and we're getting as much packed in there as we can, right, in preparation for the compression stroke. So at some point, the piston is going to reach bottom dead center. Now the piston is going to start traveling back up, and that is going to be the beginning of the compression stroke. At some point after bottom dead center, the intake valve will shut. The time in which you shut the intake valve is really critical to creating ideal cylinder pressure at varying RPMs. So you guys may already know this, but with a more aggressive cam or more intake duration, typically that larger intake duration is going to cause that intake valve to shut later, thereby reducing the amount of cylinder pressure you're making at lower RPMs. And this also is going to cause a lower amount of volumetric efficiency or lower amount of cylinder fill, as I like to call it, at lower RPM. But in exchange for that, of course, you can see more efficiency, more cylinder fill at higher RPM. It really depends on what you're doing. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about valve events specifically at a later time in a later class. But let's keep moving on. So the intake valve is shut, and now we are on the compression stroke. And typically that intake valve is going to shut about 40 to 45 degrees after bottom dead center. So you're not even halfway up the cylinder at that point. So the piston is traveling upward now. Now both valves are shut. So because both valves are shut, we are creating compression, right? So the closer and closer that piston gets to the top dead center, the more compression we're creating. And at some point before top dead center, typically, you're going to have the spark plug get fired, right, via the ignition system. So the earlier you fire the plug before top dead center, the more cylinder pressure you're going to generate sooner. And this is a critical value that all tuners are going to look at, and that's called spark advance, right? And typically, your spark advance is going to vary that you're going to need depending on RPM, depending on load, depending on the efficiency of the motor, depending on if you're talking about a small block Chevy, from the 70s, or you're talking about an LS1, LT1, so on and so forth. So typically, the more efficient the motor is, the less spark advance we need to run, or the later we need to fire that plug before the piston reaches top dead center. So these are all things to keep in mind, because of course you do not want to run too much spark advance, because that could be detrimental to your engine. So that value which you're going to choose is going to be dependent on your applications. So we won't get specifics. We won't get into specifics on that because it varies so much, but just know that more is not necessarily better. So it just really depends. But nonetheless, at some point before top dead center, that plug is going to be fired. Now the piston is going to hit top dead center, and we're going to start the beginning of the power stroke or combustion stroke. So again, both valves are shut. Keep that in mind. So cylinder pressure is really starting to increase now as the flame front or flame propagation is occurring. So now you have expansion of gases. You have even more cylinder pressure being generated, and that's forcing the piston to go back down the hole, right? So again, this is our power stroke. And some people may think, or there's some people that believe that on the power stroke, you're actually seeing less cylinder pressure. But no, actually, as the piston is traveling down the hole, you're creating more and more cylinder pressure until the exhaust valve starts to open. Once the exhaust valve starts to open, that begins what's called the blowdown phase. The blowdown phase is measured from the time in which the exhaust valve opens until the piston reaches bottom dead center. That blowdown phase is extremely critical. Just like when we close our intake valve is critical, the beginning of the blowdown phase is also very critical. The earlier that you start the blowdown phase, the less pumping losses you're going to see. And those pumping losses are basically cylinder pressure working against the piston on the exhaust stroke, causing you to make less power. So when you want to start the blowdown phase, or when you want to start the exhaust valve opening event, is going to depend greatly on, say, if you have long tube headers, what fuel you're using again. If you're boosted, typically you don't need to try to retain as much cylinder pressure. So at that point, you really can get away with opening the exhaust valve a little sooner in exchange for getting rid of those spent uh, or inert gases at that point to get them out of the cylinder. All right, so we've begun the blowdown phase. Exhaust valve has begun to open, and at some point, that piston is going to reach bottom dead center. And then, of course, we're going to start our exhaust stroke. So the exhaust stroke, again, the pistons starting to travel back up the cylinder. And now your exhaust valve should be pretty much fully open by, somewhere mid travel up the cylinder. And so the exhaust valve being fully open, intake valve is still shut right now at this point. Now we're just really focusing on getting those inert gases out of the cylinder so we can make room for fresh charge, right? Fresh air charge, fresh molecules, so we can make all the power again. Now, depending on your camshaft profile, you may actually see that intake valve start to open before the piston reaches top dead center on the exhaust stroke. Okay, so if your exhaust valve and your intake valve are open at the same time, then you're going to have what's called overlap, right? The more overlap you have, the more reversion you can see. Basically, that's being cylinder pressure going back up through the intake valve into the intake manifold. So reversion is not necessarily good. Again, though, you're going to see that as a byproduct of having more overlap. So typically, we're going to have more overlap if we have an application where we want to make more top end power, a drag race application, or a special race car, versus having a truck that you want to make as much torque as possible so you can haul your race car to the track, right? So it really depends on what you're doing in terms of how you want to design or target those valve events in conjunction with how the engine is operating. All right, so it's pretty cool stuff. I really like thinking about that. Now, we've kind of discussed the four strokes right now. We've also discussed the importance and what's occurring during the four strokes. So let's think about this. All right. Um, the valve events in conjunction with those four strokes, we've pretty much talked about that a lot. I really want to talk more about volumetric efficiency now and cylinder fill so you guys can have a better idea. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go to HP Tuners and we're going to open up our VCM editor and we're going to open up a sample file that you guys all should have. So if you guys don't already have your VCM editor open, I urge you to go ahead and do that right now so you can follow along and really see what's going on. So let's go to the sample. All right, I'm going to close this. All right, we've got our HP Tuners VCM editor open now. To open your sample file, you're going to go to File, you're going to go to Open, then you're going to go to Documents. And again, for you guys who might be still trying to open it up, we're going to go cover that again. So again, go back to HP Tuners, go to File, go to Open, then go to Documents, and then go to HP Tuners, and then go to Logs and Tunes, and then you'll see Samples. All right. So for today, we're going to be discussing a 2002 Chevrolet Camaro with a P01 controller. It's tried and true. We all kind of know our LS1s, so it's about the easiest thing to show you guys at this point. Now, granted, we'll talk about other motors later times, but for now, we're going to be discussing the LS1, right? Kind of the gold standard in our industry anymore. Nonetheless, okay, so let's open up the VE table. All right, so to find that VE table, we're going to go to Engine, we're going to go to Airflow, and then we're going to go to Primary VE. All right, so now you'll notice this is a three-dimensional table. We have engine speed on our x-axis or column axis. We have manifold absolute pressure on our y-axis or row axis, right? Those are the two lookups. And then in the Z, you've got your actual volumetric efficiency. So this is pretty interesting because this is basically an airflow model or a model of efficiency of the engine at varying loads and varying engine speeds. So we talked a lot, not a lot, but we've talked about camshaft profiles and the effect that could have. So let's say you put that big Lopi cam in there with a lot of overlap. This VE table is not going to be applicable anymore. You're going to have to make quite a few adjustments to this VE table to get it right to get your fueling back where it needs to be. So this is very critical to proper engine operation, especially if you don't have a mass airflow sensor, which we will discuss as well. So this is the main model. All right. Now it's 0 to 100%. 100% being it's completely efficient. That cylinder is holding the most air it can. Basically, it's filled up the most that it can, or that glass of water is completely full and about to overspill. Right. So that is ideal. Right. That is also going to correspond with peak torque. Right. So peak VE and peak torque go hand in hand, and I'll show you guys more about what that looks like and how that looks like on a dynograph, for example. All right. So if you look here in your idle range, so that's going to be anywhere from 25 to 40 kPa, or even higher if you have a bigger cam. The bigger the cam, the less vacuum you're going to generate, so the more manifold pressure that you'll have at idle. But typically speaking, our stock LS1s can be somewhere around 30 kPa at idle, up to 800 RPM of idle speed, maybe higher if you are talking about cold start scenarios. All right, so at that range, we're looking at about 60% volumetric efficiency. All right. So 60% of our cylinder is being filled with its potential, right? We're obtaining 60% of that potential of what it can hold. Now, as you go to part throttle, you're typically going to see even lower manifold pressure at that point. But your VE is going to stay pretty similar in that range. It's going to vary, of course, but yeah, so we're looking pretty good between 65 to 75 volumetric efficiency or percent volumetric efficiency. Once you go wide open throttle, though, that's when things get a little more interesting. All right, so once you go wide open, you should see, depending on where you're at, anywhere from 90 to 100 kPa at wide open throttle. and that's manifold pressure or kilopascals. So to give you an idea, 100 kPa is equal to 14.7 psi, is equal to about 29.5 inches mercury. And if you want to get really crazy, 762 torr, I think it is. So for you Viper guys back there and back in the Stone Ages where we looked at that, but nonetheless, all right. So 100 kPa at wide open throttle. All right. Now, for you guys who are in Colorado or higher altitude areas, you're gonna say, well, wide open throttle, well, I'm only seeing 85 kPa. Well, that's because your engine is breathing less efficiently because you're at a higher altitude. So when you're at a higher altitude, you have less air charge being generated in the motor. So of course you're going to generate less power. So you guys already know that, right? But for now, we're going to assume we're at sea level to make things easier to understand. So wide open throttle, 100 kPa, you're going to see a variation of volumetric efficiency as we go through the RPM range at wide open throttle. Typically, most of our pulls are going to start around 2,500. They're going to end around 6,000 RPM. So we'll just kind of keep that as our base. All right, so as you look along here, once we get to about 4,400 RPM, you'll see 99% volumetric efficiency. That means that 99% of our cylinder is being filled to its max, right? It's basically the most it can hold. The only way that we could go above 100% volumetric efficiency is if we have boost, right? If you have boost, then a lot of things go out the door. Theories change, but we're not going to get into boost today. We're just going to keep it simple with naturally aspirated theory, okay? So naturally aspirated, most you're going to see typically is 100% VE. All right, so now at 4,400 RPM, we have 99%, and this is where I'm going to show you on the dyno graph where it should correlate. So let's pull this PowerPoint up, and let's go to our dyno graph, right? So if you look here on the dyno graph, we're going to find 4,400 RPM. Let's see if I can make that a little bigger for you guys real quick. All right, so do that. 4,400 RPM is about right here. And that's also where we saw 99% volumetric efficiency in our VE table. So that makes perfect sense. That means that the airflow model is extremely accurate from GM. So that means they did their job properly, which we would only come to expect, okay? So you guys might notice, though, as you went to higher RPM, your volumetric efficiency does start to drop off. As your VE starts to drop off, that doesn't mean that your power is going to drop off because we have what's called momentum, right? And this is where that cam profile really comes into play. Okay, as I said before, the later that you close your intake valve, the more efficiency you'll have at a higher RPM. So let's say we didn't want our peak VE and peak torque to be at 4,400 RPM, we'd want to close that intake valve later. So the later we close that intake valve, the further to the right, you're going to shift your peak VE or shift your peak torque, right? So that's ideal for certain situations. But again, if you're in a truck, for example, you wouldn't want that necessarily, right? We might want to make our intake valve close earlier, right? It just really depends on the situation. But I just want to get you guys thinking in the right mode of where I'm trying to think, all right, and try and show you. Okay, again, we have momentum from engine speed, right? So we have mechanical momentum of the pistons and rods rotating around, okay? So we're still generating more horsepower. Now, here's the thing. This is where spark advance will come into play, and I want to show you guys that spark map so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But as VE drops off, we must compensate for that lack of efficiency by advancing spark, right? Now, granted, sometimes you may not need to do that. It just really, again, depends on the situation that you're talking about or the car that you're tuning at that time. But typically, you're going to see somewhat of an increase in spark advance after peak torque or after your highest point of volumetric efficiency. So as VE drops, spark advance goes up, right? And at some point, you're going to hit peak power. And at that point, you're done, okay? Now, granted, we still want to shift our car a little bit beyond peak power. So once we shift, we can get right back into that peak torque range and we can make more acceleration, make better ETs, faster lap times, so on and so forth. All right, so let's get out of this if we can. Okay. All right. I'm going to go back to the VCM editor, and I'm going to pull up the Spark Advanced table. And you guys see there, of course, that your VE is dropping off at higher RPM, just to show you again. So let's go to our Spark table. So to find our Spark Advanced table, we're going to go to Engine, we're going to Spark, and go to Advanced. All right. Now, for this application, we're typically going to be looking at the high octane Spark table. It also does use the low octane if it sees a certain amount of knock retard over a certain amount of time. But we're going to just work in the high octane Spark table. All right. Okay. So much like our VE table, we have engine speed on our x-axis or column axis, and we have cylinder air mass on our row axis or y-axis. Okay. So obviously, this is a different unit of measure, but you can still think of it in terms of volumetric efficiency or even manifold pressure. All right. So essentially, 1 gram per cycle per cylinder is going to be the equivalent of 100 kPa at wide open throttle as long as you're at sea level. Okay. That's also going to be the equivalent to 100% cylinder fill. Once you go above 1.0 gram, now you're talking about boost again. Or yeah, you may see a little bit above that on a really well-built NA car too. But typically it's going to be reserved for boost-only applications. So wide open throttle, depending on the efficiency of your engine, we're probably not going to see 1.0 at a with a stock engine. We're going to be closer to like 0.80, 0.84, maybe 0.76, depending on the car. A truck is going to be 0.75 or so. So you're going to see some fluctuation there. But as you can tell, let's find our 4,400 RPM range again. Right there, we see 18 to 19 degrees spark advance. All right. Once you get to a higher RPM and that efficiency drops off, we're going to see an increase in spark advance as I described. So once you get to about 6,000 RPM, you could see up to 24 degrees of timing. That's measured in rotational degrees before top dead center. So again, the higher that number, the earlier we're firing that plug on the compression stroke before the piston reaches top dead center. Now, some of you guys may say, well, why do I see negative timing sometimes? Well, negative spark advance is when it's firing after top dead center. And you're going to see that sometimes on EcoBoost applications at certain situations. Also, you can see that when you see torque management coming into play and it's reducing spark during a shift. So that's also possible that you may see that. But typically, we're not going to see negative spark advance at wide open throttle. We're going to see positive spark advance. And again, the value which we choose for spark advance is going to vary greatly on what application you're talking about, what application you're tuning. But I will tell you that the less efficiency typically requires more spark. Now, there are other exceptions to this rule. Let's talk about that big low cam again. That big low cam with more overlap is going to bleed off cylinder pressure, right? By way of dynamic compression, right? We all know a static compression, 10 to 1, 11 to 1, 11 half to 1, but dynamic compression is going to be directly affected by our valve events or our times in which we open and close the valves. And again, we're going to talk more about that in depth later on. So you guys can, again, stay tuned for those later classes, which will be really fun. A lot of good information coming your way for that. But nonetheless, so hopefully you guys are getting a little bit better idea of how spark advance is going to come into play in conjunction with cylinder pressure, in conjunction with VE, in conjunction with cylinder fill. So these are all kind of intertwined. It's pretty cool when you start seeing that relationship start to form between all these items. Hopefully that helps sum up some of those questions you guys may have had at home. And we're going to move on here to talk about mass airflow. All right. So we're going to look at a mass airflow calibration table. All right, so let's go to Engine, back to our Airflow tab, and let's find our mass airflow calibration. So that's going to be airflow versus frequency. All right, so here's your frequency. It's going to range from 1,500 hertz to 12,000 hertz on this particular application. Newer GM models, you may see up to 15,000 hertz. So it just, again, varies on application that you're dealing with. within here, there's some kind of a cool trick I want to tell you guys about. All right, so you're going to see this measured typically in pounds per minute. However, you can change your unit of measure in the VCM editor to whatever is more suitable for your taste or your preference. So you have pounds per second, kilograms per minute, kilograms per hour, grams per second, pounds per hour, and pounds per minute. I look at everything in pounds per minute because of the trick I'm about to tell you about. Now, if you look, let's say, what did this guy make? Let's go back to our dyno graph here. Made, my eyes are deceiving me. Looks like about 304 horsepower. So 304 horsepower is the same basically as 30 pounds per minute of airflow. So go back to the mass airflow table. Let's find 34 pounds per minute. Right about there, or sorry, 30 pounds per minute. So right about here. So that equates to 9,250 hertz. So I'm willing to bet that at wide open throttle, at that peak horsepower range, we saw 9,250 hertz because you basically take your pounds per minute value, multiply it by 10, and that gives you your horsepower at the crank. Now, granted, we're talking wheel horsepower with this dyno graph, so there might be a little bit of fluctuation there, but the math works out. It's pretty cool when you start looking at it. I've tested the theory on multiple engines on the engine dyno, and it works. So for you guys at home that don't have a dyno and you can go out and log your car, you can see what power you're making. Granted, I wouldn't do that on the street. I do it at the track, but nonetheless, you can look at your pounds per minute of airflow, and I can give you a rough idea of what you're making at the crank for horsepower. Now, if you guys have supercharged applications, cars with different injectors, this could go out the window if your mass airflow calibration is not accurate or valid. Now, you may ask, when would it not be valid? Well, that's going to depend on how well you've characterized your injectors. So, if you don't have the proper injector data in the calibration, or you kind of had to guess because you didn't have data available, that could definitely throw your mass airflow calibration off, which is going to throw the airflow model off. It's going to throw the torque calculation off. It's going to affect how your transmission shifts. It's going to have a lot of cascading effects if you don't get that injector characterization just right. So that has direct impact on your mass airflow. Now, back in the day, I don't know if you guys may remember some of the Fords back in the day where you'd buy a mass airflow calibrated to a set of injectors or vice versa. That was not really the right way to do it, but it was the way they had to do it. It was a workaround essentially. So, but it worked for them. But again, the airflow model was off, the torque model was off. So they're probably getting way too much timing because this mass airflow table also affects your spark table, right? So if you have a scaled tune, so to speak, where you've had to cut the mass airflow in half, which I don't use that method, but some guys do use that method. If you do use that method, you would have to adjust your spark map accordingly. So this mass airflow table affects cylinder air mass calculations. So that cylinder air mass, if that's not correct, you can get too much timing, and that's bad, right? So again, we were talking about at wide open throttle, you're going to see, a really good scenario, you see 1 gram, right? But let's say that mass airflow table is cut in half. Well, now you're going to see 0.5 grams at wide open throttle. And instead of getting 18 degrees of timing, you're going to get 31 degrees of timing. And you guys can already guess that might be bad. It's going to be bad. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it ain't going to last long. So I really recommend making sure that you got that mass airflow table just right. But again, a lot of this information is for another time. But I'm just trying to give you little tidbits so you can kind of think about that and take it with you and do what you like with it. All right. So that's a brief rundown of your mass airflow. Now let's go into cylinder heads. This is just a quick overview, right? So we talked about our cylinder. We haven't really touched on the combustion chamber, but we have touched a little bit on static compression or dynamic compression, or both, right? So your cylinder head is going to have an impact on all this as well, right? So the larger your combustion chamber volume is, the less static compression you're going to see. So less static compression you see, the more timing you can typically get away with. But again, it's all situationally dependent. So I really can't tell you a definitive answer on that. It depends on you. Okay. So that combustion chamber design also has an impact on how your air fuel mixture is being compressed and how combustion is occurring, flame front propagation, so on and so forth. So, you know, cylinder heads are super critical. I mean, that's allowing the airflow in and the spent fuel air mixture out. Now let's talk about like a boosted application, for example. Your exhaust is going to be so much more critical on your cylinder head. Your exhaust burner is going to be a lot more critical on your cylinder head with a boosted application because you really need to focus on that. Because with a boosted application, you're packing that airflow into the cylinder, into the combustion chamber. So it doesn't need nearly as much help as it's going to need on the back end to get those inert gases out. Because you guessed it, the more molecules you can pack in, the more oxygen you can pack into the cylinder, the more inert gases you're going to have. So the more efficiency you need on the exhaust side. All right. So the intake side is a lot more critical on a naturally aspirated application. So that's where there's a lot of magic that happens. I'll call it with cylinder heads. And so you've got some brilliant minds out there with cylinder head design, which I'm not one of those minds in cylinder head design. I'm the tuner guy, right? But there's some great guys out there that can really share some good knowledge with you on that. But they definitely have a huge impact. Now, the other thing would be our valve sizing. Valve sizing isn't nearly as, I'll call it not nearly as critical now because most of your cylinder heads, LS and up, are going to be extremely efficient in terms of their valve sizing. But there is also something to be gained with that, especially if you're trying to grab every last inch of power from a naturally aspirated application. So it really, they say racing is a game of ounces and inches, and they're not wrong, right? So they're trying to grab every last bit that they can, right? So it really that comes into play. Now, also, if you've milled your cylinder heads, when you mill your cylinder head, you're lowering the volume size, so you're increasing your static compression, and also dynamic at that point. But that can also have an impact as well in how much timing you run. So if you mill your heads, you don't change your cam profile, you probably want to pull some timing out of there to be safe. So just word to the wise. That's just a brief cylinder head overview. I wanted to discuss that real fast with you guys. We'll talk more about that later, I'm sure, in other times, other classes. Okay, and compression ratio and ignition timing considerations. We've naturally talked a lot about this already, so I don't want to beat a dead horse there because there's a lot of information we're covering here today. Um, so some other things I also want to talk about before we get into exhaust efficiency, which we kind of already talked about as well, is you've seen the editor, you have not seen the scanner. All right, so the editor is extremely critical, of course. We all know this. That's our gateway to being able to modify, remap, recalibrate, whatever you want to call it, tune the car, right? However, the scanner is our eyes and ears, right? It's where we're gathering the information. The car's telling us what it wants, right? It tells us what it needs. That's why we have that scanner. And the scanner is extremely critical to being able to properly tune a vehicle or even diagnose a vehicle. Heck, I don't even use really any other scan tools in my shop because I've got VCM scanner, and honestly, it works extremely well, and they're only adding more features every day. So it's a great tool to have, even if you're not tuning any cars. Get a cable, download VCM Scanner, and use it and try it, and it's awesome, right? If you guys want to request some basic channel configs from me, I'll do my best to field that for you for different applications. But yeah, I can definitely help you kind of get started in the right direction. All right, so let's look at this here. We've got a sample open. This is from a 2009 Chevy Silverado. Okay, we do have an O2 Camaro open in the editor. However, they're very similar, they're same controller. So we can take this data and just kind of show you how this would work. And it's pretty cool. So you guys, please stay tuned here. All right. So let's say that we're working on the VE table. All right. So we're making some adjustments. We changed our cam, we did a few other things. So now we've gone into the scanner and we're going to collect this information. What's extremely awesome, what I love about the scanner is we can replicate what's in the VCM editor. We can replicate that table in the scanner, right? So let's open up our VE table. Let's copy some data from the VE table. Let's put it into the scanner real quick, just so you guys can see how this works, because it's pretty cool, right? Go back to the editor, go to Airflow, go to your VE. All right, so first things first, we're going to look at our X and Y axes. Again, engine speed, manifold pressure. We're going to right click, go to column axis, and we're going to copy labels. All right. Now we're going to go to our scanner, and we're going to right click in our top right of our screen there in the scanner. Go to graph layout. Okay, and just FYI, this is the default layout. I didn't change the layout. This is the one you guys have right when you download the scanner. So keep that in mind. All right, so we're going to make a new graph. So we're going to select add graph and add table. All right, so we've got a new table here. And now, what parameter do you want to log? So if we are doing our VE tuning, we need to log our long-term field trim plus our short-term field trim to get an average from that. So we're going to left click here on parameter, and you can just type in the text filter. It makes it really easy. You go to LTFT plus STFT. All right. We're going to make that 2 decimals. Cell hits required 3 or 4 or 5, whatever you want to do. High value 25. That's going to be stand for 25%. Low value 25. And then for high value 25, we're going to make that red because that means that the ECU was having to add fuel in order to correct the air fuel ratio mixture. And green for if it's too rich. All right. All right, so we got that. And now this is the cool part. All right, so we can right click in here, select column axis, and copy labels. So sorry, I went a little fast there, but I went back to the VCM editor. All right, pulled that up. We're in our VE table. Again, we're going to right click, column axis, copy labels. All right, we're going to go here, right click and paste. And now, or Control V, Control C, Control V, whatever you want to do there. Now we're going to select our parameter. Our parameter for our column axis or our engine is, excuse me, or our X axis, gosh darn, our column axis is going to be engine speed. All right, so we're going to type in here engine speed. All right. So we're just going to select generic. Now we're going to go to our row axis. So again, we're going to go back to our VCM editor. This is our row axis, which is manifold pressure. We're going to right click, row axis, copy labels. All right. Now we're going to paste in. All right. So our parameter for row axis is going to be manifold absolute pressure. Right. All right. Just basically asking if you just want to make a generic sensor. All it's saying is essentially it's going to look for the closest channel to what you're requesting. So that is easier to do it that way. So our unit is not going to be PSI. It's going to be manifold, excuse me, kilopascals, right? And we have there already 15 to 105. So now you have successfully recreated your VE table in the scanner. All right, we're going to close the graph layout editor, and we're going to go to our LTFT plus STFT. Okay, now this is where the magic happens. So to select this entire table, left click in the top left box, you're going to right click or Control C and copy. Right? We go back to our editor table. Excuse me, we're going to go back to the VCM editor, and we're going to open up our VE table in case you haven't opened it already. And again, you're going to left click in the top left, and you're going to right click, and you're going to paste special. And now you can multiply by percent or multiply by percent half. Depending on how far off you are, you may want to go by a full percent, or you may just want to go by 0.5% so you don't overshoot your target. All right, we're going to do by full percentage just so you guys get the full effect. Okay, so now, instead of you having to go cell by cell, row by row, column by column, you can just simply paste special, multiply by percent, and now it has proportionally adjusted the cells in the VE table by the percentage adjustment that the ECU was having to make per cell. This is like my favorite feature that of hptuners. So it's really, really powerful. Saves me a lot of time on the dyno, on the street, trying to get cars done for customers. Okay. So now we've modified our VE table, and then we can go back in and clean it up, of course, which you can use the interpolate function, and that will basically find the average and apply that average as you go along there, right? And so on and so forth. you guys get the idea. So that's extremely helpful in trying to efficiently and effectively tune a car or recalibrate a VU table. So just want to show you guys that real quick. Yeah, so again, the scanner is extremely powerful. We're going to use the graphs. We're going to get more into the scanner. We're going to get more into the functionality there as we go along in later classes and cover more topics. But I just want to show you guys that specifically. I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this. And as far as exhaust efficiency, we've talked about that, tuning considerations, so we're pretty good there. So really, these are the main topics I wanted to discuss for today. Now, if you guys, again, have any questions as we go along or have any questions after the fact, please feel free to contact me, contact hptuners, support hptuners, or me, Alex at peitsperformancetunes.com, or at Peitz Performance on Instagram. We're also on Facebook. So we got a lot of stuff, a lot of ways you can reach us. We're more than happy to help you out however we can, when we can. So that brings us to the fun part you guys have all been waiting for. Okay, so we are going to be giving away an MPVI2. So if you guys have been listening along, you already know the answer or you've heard the answer. So here's my question. At what is it called? The value, or excuse me, the period of time. What is it called after the the exhaust valve starts to open before the piston reaches bottom dead center? What is that period of time called in conjunction with the 4 strokes that we've discussed? Again, what is the time in which the exhaust valve starts to open before the piston reaches bottom dead center on the power stroke, right? Or the combustion stroke, excuse me. So for you, first person to answer correctly is going to win an MPVI2. And I'll ask it one more time. What is the period of time called when the exhaust valve opens before the piston reaches bottom dead center on the power stroke? And okay, right. Yep, blowdown phase. Okay, I'm trying to find. Did you send it to me on chat? All right, guys. So we got a winner. It's one Jacob McGrath. So congratulations, Jacob. We really appreciate you playing along and listening along. And I really hope you enjoy that MPVI too. And feel free to contact us about that. And also, you have answered the question correctly, of course. You have won the prize. Please email marketing@hptuners.com. Include your YouTube screen name with that email as well, and they will definitely take care of you. Again, email marketing@hptuners.com, include your YouTube screen name, and they will definitely get you taken care of and get you that MPVI2, get you working and rolling to the right direction. Really, really happy for you, man. And for all the other guys who didn't answer yet or answer it correctly, no problem. There's plenty more chances to win. Again, please feel free to tune back in on our next one. I really appreciate having you guys. All right. So thank you for tuning in to the HP Tuners live stream. Again, my name is Alex Peitz of Peitz Performance Tunes. If you want to keep up with my latest builds on YouTube, I have my YouTube channel, which is Alex Peitz. And also make sure to follow HP Tuners on Instagram and Facebook. And of course, continue to subscribe on YouTube. And also find out the date and time of the next live stream training. Again, on Instagram and Facebook is where HP Tuners is going to announce the next live stream training. So I really hope to see you guys again at that time. All right. And without further ado, appreciate it. You guys stay tuned.